You really fucked up trying to interrogate me, lizard shit. No matter what you do to me, I'll never talk. But you and your scaly friends will wish you never even heard of Earth by the time I'm through with you." Jack Armstrong spat blood in his captor's face as the neural agony device sent searing pain through his body. He'd make these Zorgon bastards pay. Lieutenant Commander Armstrong, a hardened Terran Space Fleet operative, had been captured during a vital spy mission. Earth needed the intel on the Zorgon's warships and weapons. Without it, humanity was doomed in the looming war. Failure was not an option. Now he was trapped in the reptilian alien's torture chamber. The cold metal interrogation table dug into his back. Sinister, pain-inducing machines loomed on all sides, ready to rip secrets from his mind. Krath, the merciless Zorgon Inquisitor, loomed over him, scales gleaming under harsh light. Obsidian eyes hungry for information to crush the human threat. Serrated claws caressed cruel instruments, eager to begin. But Armstrong would die before he broke. He'd faced worse than these overgrown lizards. He'd resist their torture, find a way to escape, complete his mission. He had to. The fate of all mankind depended on it. Let the interrogation begin. Krath's scaly fingers danced over the control panel of the neural agony device. The machine hummed to life, and a wave of searing pain flooded through Armstrong's body. It felt like every nerve was on fire, like his skin was being flayed off by white-hot knives. He gritted his teeth, biting back a scream. He wouldn't give the lizard the satisfaction. "You humans are so fragile," Krath hissed. "But don't worry, this device won't cause any lasting harm. We have perfected the art of inflicting suffering without damaging the subject. You will feel pain beyond your wildest imagination, but your body will remain intact, ready to endure more when your feeble mind finally shatters." Armstrong glared at Krath through the haze of agony. "Fuck you," he spat. "I've been through the Terran Space Fleet's most hardcore training. I've had my pain receptors dialed up to the max in simulations. Whatever you dish out, I can take it." He thought of his fellow operatives, his brothers and sisters in arms, the grueling drills they had endured together, forging unbreakable bonds of loyalty. The instructors who had pushed them to the brink, teaching them to compartmentalize pain, to focus on the mission above all else. He would not let them down. Krath cranked up the dial, and a fresh wave of agony crashed over Armstrong. He convulsed against his restraints, every muscle seizing, but he clung to his training like a lifeline. Breathe through the pain. Focus on a fixed point. Recite the Space Fleet oath in your mind. He would endure. He had to. Hours blurred together in a red haze of torment. Armstrong retreated deep inside his mind, blocking out the external world. At some point, Krath turned off the machine, leaving him limp and soaked in sweat, but unbroken. The Zorgon loomed over him, obsidian eyes glittering with frustration. "You cannot resist forever, human. We have other methods of extracting the information we seek." The air shimmered, and suddenly Armstrong was back on Earth. In the bombed-out ruins of a city, San Francisco, he realized, recognizing the twisted remains of the Golden Gate Bridge. Smoke stung his eyes and choked his lungs. A child's scream pierced the air. A little girl, no more than 6, stumbled out of the rubble. Her clothes were tattered, her face streaked with tears and ash. She stared at Armstrong with pleading eyes, reaching for him. "Help me," she begged. "Please, I'm scared." Armstrong's heart clenched. He knew this wasn't real, knew it was just a hologram preying on his protective instincts. But it felt so vivid. The smell of charred flesh, the distant wail of sirens, the raw terror in the girl's voice. He closed his eyes, blocking out the image, focused on his breathing, on the cold metal beneath him. This was a trick, a ploy to manipulate his emotions. He would not fall for it. The scene changed. Now he was in a Terran Space Fleet command center, alarms blaring. Officers shouted panicked orders. On the view screen, a fleet of Zorgon warships loomed in orbit above Earth. Bright flashes lit up the darkness as they rained down destruction on the helpless planet below. Lieutenant Commander Armstrong. Admiral Zhao, his mentor and surrogate father figure, grabbed him by the shoulders. Desperation etched his normally stoic features. The Zorgons have broken through our defenses. They're targeting major cities across the globe. Millions will die unless we stop them. Zhao thrust a data drive into his hands. This contains the codes to activate our last resort, a doomsday weapon that will wipe out the Zorgon fleet. His eyes bored into Armstrong's, intense and pleading. But we need the intel you gathered to pinpoint their weaknesses. You're our only hope. Armstrong's mind reeled. He knew logically that this was another simulation, but the weight of Zhao's gaze, the fear and desperation that radiated from him, it felt so real. The fate of humanity, of everyone he had sworn to protect, rested on his shoulders. He took a shaky breath, trying to center himself. This wasn't real. The doomsday weapon, the codes, Admiral Zhao's presence, it was all an illusion, a deception crafted from his own memories and fears. He couldn't let it break him. With a surge of willpower, Armstrong tore his gaze away from Zhao's holographic face. He stared straight ahead, focusing on a crack in the metal wall, recited the Space Fleet oath over and over in his mind, like a mantra, letting the familiar words drown out the sounds of simulated destruction. Gradually, the command center faded away. The metal interrogation room reformed around him. Krath stood before him, scaly brow furrowed in annoyance. "Your psychological tricks won't work on me," Armstrong rasped. His throat felt raw from screaming, though he didn't remember making a sound. "I know none of that was real. You can't break me with illusions and fake emotions." Krath hissed in frustration, obsidian eyes narrowing. For a moment his composure slipped, revealing a flash of uncertainty. Armstrong seized on it like a drowning man clutching a life-preserver. The Zorgon's techniques were advanced, but they had limits. They could project vivid holograms and tap into his memories, but they couldn't truly understand the depths of human emotions, the bonds of loyalty, the strength of will that came from fighting for a greater cause. They saw fear and attachment as weaknesses to exploit, not sources of resilience. That was their flaw, Armstrong realized. They thought they could break him by preying on his fears and emotional connections, but those same things were what gave him the strength to resist. His love for his planet, his duty to the Space Fleet, his bond with his fellow operatives. They were his armor against the Zorgon's manipulations. He would use that knowledge to his advantage, to endure whatever torments they inflicted, knowing that each moment of defiance brought Earth closer to salvation. He just had to hold out long enough for the Space Fleet to launch their attack, to give them the window they needed to strike at the heart of the Zorgon Empire. Armstrong set his jaw, meeting Krath's gaze with steely determination. The lizard could torture him until the stars burned out, but he would never break. He would never betray his people. For Earth, for humanity, he would endure. Armstrong's body screamed in agony, every nerve raw and frayed from the relentless torture. His mind felt like a shattered mirror, fragments of memory and identity scattered by the Zorgon's psychological onslaught. But beneath the pain and exhaustion, a flicker of defiance still burned. He studied Krath through half-lidded eyes, taking in the Zorgon's tense posture and tightly clenched claws. The interrogator's frustration was palpable, his earlier smugness giving way to a hint of uncertainty. Armstrong seized on that flicker of doubt, like a starving man grasping a scrap of food. "So you know, Krath," he rasped, his voice rough from screaming. "I've been studying your kind for years, your tactics, your culture, your psychology, and I've come to a realization." Krath's obsidian eyes narrowed, his scaly brow furrowing. "And what is that, human?" Armstrong forced a smirk, ignoring the way it pulled at his cracked lips. "You're not as strong as you think you are." The Zorgon hissed, his claws tightening on the control panel. "You dare question our strength? We have conquered countless worlds, enslaved entire species. Your pitiful planet will be no different." "But that's just it," Armstrong pressed, holding Krath's gaze. "You rely on fear and brute force to control others. You don't understand true strength, the kind that comes from within, from believing in something greater than yourself." He let out a harsh laugh, the sound grating in his raw throat. "You think you can break me with pain and mind games? I've faced worse in training simulations. My resolve comes from my duty, my loyalty to my people, something you could never comprehend." Krath's scales rippled with agitation, his composure slipping. "You know nothing of our ways, human. We are the apex predators of the galaxy. We will crush your species beneath our claws." Armstrong shook his head, a mocking smile playing on his lips. "You're just a cog in the machine, Krath, a tool of your empire's conquest. But what happens when you fail? When you can't break me, can't extract the information your superiors demand?" He leaned forward as far as his restraints allowed, his voice dropping to a whisper. "They'll cast you aside, replace you with someone stronger, more ruthless, because that's all you are to them. Expendable." Krath recoiled as if struck, his eyes widening. For a moment Armstrong glimpsed a flicker of fear, of doubt in those obsidian depths. The Zorgon's claws trembled on the control panel, his earlier confidence cracking. Armstrong pressed his advantage, his words precise and cutting. "I've seen it before in other interrogators. They break just like they try to break their prisoners, because deep down they know their methods are flawed. That fear and pain can only push someone so far." He held Krath's gaze, his own eyes burning with conviction. "But I have something you never will, a purpose beyond myself, a belief in the strength of the human spirit, and that's why you'll never win." Krath's composure shattered, a snarl ripping from his throat. He slammed his fist against the control panel, sending sparks flying. The interrogation room plunged into darkness, the hum of machinery falling silent. In the sudden stillness, Armstrong heard the Zorgon's ragged breathing, the scrape of claws on metal. He braced himself for another onslaught of pain, another barrage of holographic illusions. But instead, Krath's voice cut through the shadows, raw and shaken. You know nothing of our ways, of the sacrifices we make for the glory of the Empire." Armstrong sensed the uncertainty in the Zorgon's tone, the hairline fractures in his resolve. He pushed harder, his words razor-sharp. "Sacrifices? You mean the lives you ruin, the worlds you destroy? The way you sacrifice your own kind's individuality and free will for the sake of conquest?" He let out a bitter laugh. "That's not glory, Krath, that's slavery. And deep down I think you know it." The Zorgon let out a hiss, but there was a note of hesitation in the sound, a crack in the armor of his convictions. Armstrong felt a flicker of hope amid the pain and exhaustion. He was getting through to Krath, chipping away at the foundations of the interrogator's beliefs. If he could just push a little further, find the right pressure point. He thought of Earth, of the billions of lives hanging in the balance, of the sacrifices his fellow operatives had made, the risks they took every day to keep humanity safe. He couldn't let them down. With a deep breath, Armstrong gathered his strength, preparing for the next round of their mental duel. He would keep fighting, keep resisting, until he either broke free or broke the Zorgon's will. No matter the cost, he would not yield. Earth depended on him. Krath paced the interrogation room, his claws clicking against the metal floor. Frustration and desperation rolled off him in waves, his earlier composure shattered by Armstrong's unyielding defiance. The human's words echoed in his mind, taunting him with doubts and insecurities he had long suppressed. He couldn't fail, not again. His superiors were already questioning his methods, his ability to break the human prisoner. If he didn't extract the information they needed, if he couldn't prove his worth. Krath shuddered, pushing aside thoughts of the consequences. He had one last option, one final gambit to crack Armstrong's resolve. It was a risk, but he was out of alternatives. He turned to his subordinates, who stood nervously at the edge of the room. "Bring in the neural interface," he ordered, his voice rough with strain. The other Zorgons exchanged uneasy glances. "Sir," one ventured, "the device is still experimental. We haven't fully tested its safety or effectiveness. The risks—" "I am aware of the risks," Krath snapped, his scales rippling with agitation. But we have no choice. The human's mind is too strong, his will too unbreakable. This is our only chance to extract the information we need." The subordinates hesitated a moment longer, then nodded reluctantly. They hurried from the room, returning moments later with a sleek, sinister-looking device. Wires and electrodes snaked from its surface, glinting under the harsh lights. Krath took the interface from them, running his claws over its smooth contours. He had seen it in action once before, watched as it ripped secrets from a prisoner's mind like meat from bone. But that subject had been weak, their mental defenses crumbling under the onslaught. Armstrong would be a far greater challenge. He turned to the human, who watched him through hooded eyes. Exhaustion and pain lined Armstrong's face, but his gaze still burned with defiance. "Last chance, human," Krath hissed. "Tell me what I want to know, or face the consequences." Armstrong let out a harsh laugh, the sound grating in his raw throat. "Do your worst, lizard. I'll never betray my people." Krath's jaw clenched, a surge of anger and frustration boiling up inside him. He would break this human, shatter his mind, and feast on the secrets within. He would prove his worth, his strength, his unshakable loyalty to the Empire. With a snarl, he jammed the electrodes against Armstrong's temples, ignoring the human's hiss of pain. He activated the interface, bracing himself as it hummed to life. At first there was only darkness, a yawning void that seemed to stretch on forever. Then, slowly, images began to flicker at the edges of Krath's consciousness, fragments of memories, snatches of thoughts and emotions. He pushed deeper, forcing his way into Armstrong's mind. The human's mental defenses were strong, a fortress of iron will and unbreakable loyalty. But Krath was relentless, battering against those walls with all the fury and desperation of a drowning man. He could feel Armstrong's pain, his exhaustion, the cracks in his armor. Just a little more pressure, a little more force, and he would shatter. The secrets Krath sought were tantalizingly close, glimmering just out of reach. With a roar of triumph, Krath surged forward, his mind slamming against Armstrong's with all the force of a supernova. For a moment, he felt the human's defenses waver, felt them begin to crumble under the onslaught. But then something shifted. Armstrong's mind seemed to twist, to contort in ways that defied comprehension. The human's thoughts and memories swirled together, merging and fracturing in a dizzying kaleidoscope of images and sensations. Krath reeled back, his own mind recoiling from the chaos. He tried to disentangle himself, to wrench free of the maelstrom, but it was too late. Armstrong's consciousness surged forward, engulfing him like a tidal wave. Pain exploded behind Krath's eyes, a white-hot agony that seared through every nerve ending. He screamed, his body convulsing as the feedback from Armstrong's mind overwhelmed the neural interface. Warnings blared from the device, red lights flashing in a frantic strobe. Krath's subordinates shouted in alarm, rushing forward to try and shut down the interface, but it was too late. With a blinding flash of light, the device exploded, sending shards of metal and plastic flying in all directions. Krath's body slammed against the far wall, his skull shattering on impact. He was dead before he hit the floor, his lifeless eyes staring sightlessly at the ceiling. The other Zorgans fared little better. The shockwave from the explosion sent them flying, their bodies crumpling like rag dolls. Some lay still, unmoving, while others twitched and convulsed, blood leaking from their eyes and ears. In the center of the room, Armstrong sat slumped in his chair, his head lolling to one side. The electrodes had been blown clear of his temples, leaving angry red burns in their wake. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow and labored. But he was alive. Against all odds, against the full might of the Zorgon Empire he had endured. His mind, his will, his unbreakable spirit had proven stronger than any torture, any technology. He had won, but at what cost? The room lay in ruins around him, the bodies of his captors strewn like broken dolls. Smoke and sparks filled the air, the acrid scent of burning flesh and melted plastic. Distantly, alarms began to blare, a warning of the chaos to come. Armstrong forced his eyes open, forced himself to take in the destruction. His body screamed in agony, every nerve raw and frayed. His mind felt like shattered glass, the pieces jagged and cutting. But beneath the pain, beneath the exhaustion, a flicker of triumph burned. He had done it. He had protected Earth's secrets, protected his people. Whatever happened now, whatever fate awaited him, he had fulfilled his duty. With a groan, Armstrong struggled to his feet, his legs trembling beneath him. He staggered toward the door, toward the unknown dangers that lay beyond. There would be more battles to fight, more challenges to overcome. But for now, in this moment, he had won, and that was enough. Armstrong's body trembled with pain and exhaustion, every nerve raw and frayed from the relentless torture. His mind felt like a shattered mirror, fragments of memory and identity scattered by the Zorgon's brutal interrogation. But as he surveyed the smoking ruins of the chamber, the bodies of his captors lying broken and lifeless, a flicker of hope ignited in his chest. This was his chance, his one shot at escape, at survival, at completing his mission and saving Earth from the Zorgon threat. With a grunt of effort, Armstrong forced his battered body to move. His muscles screamed in protest as he strained against the restraints, the metal biting into his flesh. But he pushed through the pain, drawing on the last reserves of his strength. The restraints gave way with a snap, and he tumbled forward, barely catching himself on the edge of the interrogation table. For a moment, he simply hung there, gasping for breath, his vision swimming. Then slowly he pushed himself upright. His legs trembled beneath him, threatening to give out at any moment, but he gritted his teeth and forced himself to take a step. Then another. He staggered to the door, his heart pounding in his ears. Beyond lay a gauntlet of Zorgon soldiers and security systems, all standing between him and freedom. But he had no choice. He had to try. Armstrong paused at the threshold, his hand hovering over the control panel. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the fight to come. Then, with a growl of determination, he slammed his fist against the panel. The door slid open with a hiss, revealing a squad of startled Zorgon guards. Armstrong didn't hesitate. He charged forward, his body moving on pure instinct and adrenaline. The first guard fell to a brutal kick to the throat, his windpipe crushed. The second got off a shot from his plasma rifle, but Armstrong twisted aside, the bolt sizzling past his ear. He closed the distance in a heartbeat, his hands a blur of motion. A palm strike to the Zorgon's chin snapped his head back, followed by a knee to the gut that doubled him over. Armstrong wrenched the rifle from his hands and swung it like a club, the butt of the weapon shattering the guard's skull. More Zorgons poured into the corridor, alarms blaring. Armstrong met them head-on, his body a whirlwind of violence. He fought with a savage intensity, fueled by desperation and a lifetime of training. Plasma bolts sizzled past him, scorching the walls and floor. But he never slowed, never faltered. He ducked and weaved, using the guards' own weapons against them. A shot to the chest, a blow to the head, a knee to the groin. One by one they fell, until the corridor was littered with bodies. Armstrong stood among them, chest heaving, blood dripping from a dozen wounds. But he was alive, and he was free. He staggered onward, his mind racing. He needed a ship away off this cursed planet, and he needed it fast before the Zorgons realized what had happened. A sign caught his eye, pointing the way to the facility's hangar bay. Armstrong followed it, his steps growing steadier as he pushed through the pain. He rounded a corner and found himself face to face with a hulking Zorgon warrior, his scales gleaming in the harsh light. The warrior let out a roar of challenge, his claws flexing. Armstrong didn't hesitate. He charged forward, ducking under the Zorgon's sweeping talons. He rammed his shoulder into the warrior's gut, driving him back against the wall. They grappled in a brutal clinch, Armstrong's muscles straining against the Zorgon's inhuman strength. The warrior's jaws snapped at his throat, razor-sharp teeth grazing his skin. But Armstrong slammed his head forward, his forehead crashing into the Zorgon's snout with a sickening crunch. The warrior reeled back, howling in pain. Armstrong pressed his advantage, hammering blows into the Zorgon's body. Ribs cracked under his fists, scales split and bled. With a final, desperate surge of strength, Armstrong wrapped his arms around the warrior's neck and wrenched with all his might. There was a snap of bone, and the Zorgon went limp, his body slumping to the floor. Armstrong staggered back, gasping for breath, his vision blurred, his body screaming with pain. But he couldn't stop now, not when he was so close. He pushed himself onward, stumbling into the hangar bay. A dozen ships gleamed under the harsh lights, their hulls sleek and deadly. Armstrong's gaze settled on a small, fast-looking craft, its lines screaming of speed and maneuverability. He dragged himself to the ship, his fingers fumbling with the hatch controls. The door slid open with a hiss and he hauled himself inside, collapsing into the pilot's seat. The controls were unfamiliar, the labels written in the angular script of the Zorgon language, but Armstrong was a skilled pilot, trained to fly a dozen different types of craft. He scanned the console, his mind racing as he deciphered the alien technology. With a growl of triumph, he fired up the engines, the ship humming to life around him. He gripped the controls, his hands steady despite the pain and exhaustion. Alarms blared through the hangar as the Zorgons finally realized what was happening. Plasma bolts sizzled past the ship, scouring its hull. But Armstrong ignored them, his focus narrowing to a single point. He punched the thrusters, and the ship leapt forward, screaming out of the hangar and into the sky. The Zorgon homeworld fell away beneath him, a seething mass of dark metal and noxious smoke. Armstrong didn't look back. He set a course for the nearest Terran outpost, his heart pounding with a fierce, desperate hope. He had done it. Against all odds, he had survived. And now he would make the Zorgons pay for what they had done. News of Armstrong's escape spread like wildfire through the Terran space fleet. His daring exploits, his unwavering courage in the face of unimaginable torture, became the stuff of legend. Recruits whispered his name in awe, veterans toasted his bravery in the mess halls. But Armstrong himself remained focused on the mission. The intelligence he had gathered during his captivity, the secrets he had gleaned from the Zorgons' own minds, proved invaluable in the ongoing war. Hearth's strategists pored over the data, analyzing weaknesses in the Zorgon defenses, exploitable gaps in their supply lines, and slowly, painstakingly, they began to turn the tide. A series of daring raids crippled key Zorgon outposts, cutting off their reinforcements and supplies. Terran ships, armed with the latest in human ingenuity and determination, struck deep into enemy territory, hitting the Zorgons where they were weakest. And at the forefront of every battle, every desperate charge and last-ditch stand was Armstrong. Promoted to the rank of commander, he led his soldiers with an unwavering courage and determination that inspired all who fought beside him. They struck at the heart of the Zorgon war machine, a massive fortress factory that churned out the enemy's deadliest weapons. The battle was fierce, the casualties heavy, but Armstrong never faltered, never wavered. He fought with a savage intensity, his plasma rifle spitting death, his body a blur of motion. Zorgons fell before him like wheat before the scythe, their scales scorched and shattered. And when the last enemy lay dead, when the factory lay in ruins and the Terran flag flew over the wreckage, Armstrong stood tall amid the carnage. His armor was battered, his face streaked with blood and grime. But his eyes blazed with a fierce, unwavering determination. They had won this battle, but the war was far from over. The Zorgons would regroup, would strike back with all the fury of a wounded beast, but Armstrong and his soldiers would be ready for them. They would fight on against all odds, against all hope, for Earth, for humanity, for the future that hung in the balance, and with Commander Armstrong leading the charge, they knew that victory was within their grasp. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.